The story of a warlike nomad, born with a bow in his hand and raised in the saddle, is a tale nearly as old as civilization itself. Throughout the centuries, the Xiongnu, Huns, Turks, and the Mongols all seared themselves into the memory of the sedentary peoples of their day. In this video, we will talk about the ones who came before, the Scythians, the original Horselords of the ancient world. Join us now as we tell the history of perhaps the greatest warriors of antiquity, exploring the legacy they left behind from Greece to China. Shout out to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Statistically, 2 out of 3 guys will experience some kind of hair loss or male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. It happened to one of us, and although it's too late for him, it's not too late for you. He didn't act on time, but that shouldn't be the case for you, as Keeps allows you to get treated from home, and thanks to Keeps, you can avoid an awkward visit to the doctor, and your hair loss medication can be delivered to your home. Keeps offers generic versions of 2 FDA-approved hair loss products. You'll be surprised by the price. Remember, prevention is the key in these matters. Keeps treatments typically take between 4 to 6 months to see results, so it's important to act fast. The sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors. Hundreds of thousands of men trust Keeps for their hair loss prevention medication. And if you're ready to take action and prevent hair loss, go to keeps.com/kings or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Before we delve into the Scythians themselves, we must first contextualize the land which birthed them. The region we today classify as the steppe is a long and narrow corridor stretching from the Danube River in the west to the Mongolian heartland in the east, sandwiched by the haunting birch forests of Siberia to the north and by deserts, mountains, and inland seas to the south. It's a resource-scarce region, an endless sea of grass. For much of prehistory, it was nearly impossible for humans to thrive here. But around 3500 BC, everything changed. Beginning in 2 epicenters in modern-day Butai, Kazakhstan and Derevka, Ukraine, humanity started domesticating wild horses, and suddenly, the vast, unending grasslands of the steppe were no longer an impassable ocean, but an endless horizon. Now able to travel freely between fresh pastures, the peoples of the steppe were able to sustain much larger herds of goats, sheep and cattle. Thus the lifestyle of nomadic pastoralism was born, and the people who practiced it thrived. How the Scythians emerged as a distinct culture from other nomads is shrouded in mystery. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus offers us several theories, the most entertaining of which postulates that the first Scythian king, Scythes, was born from an unlikely union between Heracles and a serpent woman. Historically speaking, the Scythians probably traced their origins to the Andronovo culture, which thrived throughout much of the steppe from about 2000 BC. Around the turn of the first millennium BC, the Scythians lived somewhere east of the Altai Mountains, where they quickly established themselves as the greatest warriors of Inner Eurasia. Beginning in roughly 900 BC, they migrated west into the Ponto-Caspian region and its surrounding environs, where they conquered and displaced the nomadic Cimmerians. By the 6th century BC, the Scythians proper had established themselves in the western edge of the steppe, while tribes like the Massagetes and Sakas, to whom the Scythians were very closely related in language and culture, enjoyed domination in the central and eastern steppe. Collectively, they formed a sphere of cultural domination that extended over a massive territory from Eastern Europe to the fringes of the Chinese world. We have to remember that the Scythians were never a single monolithic people, but rather a broad cultural group with regional differences. Broadly speaking, the average Scythian was pale-skinned. According to both Greek and Chinese sources, light eyes and red hair were common among them as well. While they did dress practically for the cold, windy steppe they lived in, Scythian clothing was not primitive at all, but highly decorative, dyed in bright colors and embroidered with complex patterns. Men dressed in thick sheepskin coats, insulated with wool and held at the waist by sturdy belts decorated with fastening of gold, bronze, bone or wood, and wore trousers, well adapted for constant horse riding. Women dressed much like the men did. After all, the cold steppe was no kinder to them than to their husbands. Both men and women wore fancy headgear. Most common were these felted wool caps and these gnome-looking pointy hat things. Deeply spiritual people, the Horselords were highly skilled craftsmen, working with leather, bone, bronze, silver, wood and iron, and most valuable of all, gold. Most Scythian artifacts fall under a distinctive genre known as animal style, so called because it chiefly depicted wild animals like stags, wildcats, birds, horses, bears, wolves, as well as mythical creatures like griffins. This naturalistic art style was applied to crowns, belts, headsets, hairpins, earrings, combs, mirrors, belt fasteners, among other things. These luxuries were mainly status symbols for the elites of Scythian society. Tattoos were common among both men and women, who used soot and bone needles to inject dark patterns under their skin. These markings depicted wild predators and mythical beasts attacking prey animals as a display of the chaotic, violent harmony of nature. Tattoos were probably administered upon worthy warriors to commemorate acts of bravery, or as some sort of magical protection from the spiritual powers that be. The languages spoken by the Scythians most likely belonged to the Eastern Iranian language family, which made them distinctly related to the tongue of the ancient Persians. Not that a haughty magi in Persepolis would have seen much in common with his long-removed, warlike, nomadic northern cousins. Daily life among the Scythians was hardy and hearty. They travelled around the steppe with convoys of covered wagons, in which the women and children rode, while the men remained on horseback, herding flocks of sheep, cattle and goats. They settled in fresh grasslands by rivers, allowing their herds to drink and graze, before moving on to fresher pastures. Their diet relied heavily on the meat and milk of their herds. As they often lacked good timber, the Scythians used bones and animal droppings to fuel the fires which roasted their meat. The Scythians were heavy drinkers, with their favourite beverage being an alcoholic concoction fermented from mare's milk, which was also a staple of later nomads. More humorously to our modern sensibilities is the Scythian usage of a certain psychoactive leaf. Indeed, marijuana was regularly enjoyed by the nomads, who mainly used it in rituals, where it was burned in pits and cauldrons so everyone could get intoxicated from the vapours. Due to a lack of reliable sources, the social structure of the Scythians is something of a mystery to us. They may have followed the trifunctional hypothesis, which implies a tiered society divided into warriors, priests and commoners, which some scholars claim was the defining framework of most early Indo-European societies. Tiered as it was, Scythian society was still remarkably egalitarian for its time. Scythian women had many personal freedoms that were not afforded to women in settled civilizations. Many were raised learning how to ride, shoot and hunt alongside men. Archaeological evidence shows that in war, they fought alongside men in significant numbers. To the ancient Greeks in particular, the ferocity of Scythian wives and daughters was such a novelty that they became associated with the myth of the Amazonian warriors. Politically, the Scythians were divided into several large tribal confederations. It appears that at times, certain tribes would rise up and establish domination over all the others. Herodotus wrote that during his time, the most powerful of Scythian tribes were the Paraletae, known also as the Royal Scythians, and they looked upon all the other tribes in the light of slaves. One thing seems certain: kings and chieftains amongst the Scythians held immense power. This is evident by some of the only permanent structures the Scythians left behind: massive burial mounds, in which their highest royalty were interred, alongside all their earthly riches, slaves, and finest horses, a monument to the magnitude of their legacy. Indeed, it is because of these massive tombs that most surviving Scythian artifacts were preserved into the modern day. As we have touched on, war was one of the core pillars of Scythian culture, and the lords of the steppe were always ready for battle. Scythian tactics revolved around the ability to maneuver easily around the heavy cavalry and cumbersome infantry of the armies of the civilized world. The Scythians were the first culture in world history to perfect the mounted archer unit, which would be the backbone of so many future nomadic armies. The principal weapon of the Scythian was the composite bow, made from wood, horn, and sinew. The accuracy of these marksmen was deadly. A horselord born into the warrior caste would have been trained to shoot from the moment they could walk, and their bow would have been like an extension of the arm. The Scythians were not a one-trick steppe pony though, and they were also formidable opponents at closer range. They wielded short swords, known as akimekis, as well as daggers and battle axes. They were deadly with the throwing javelin, and employed the use of heavy iron spears as a sort of proto-couch lance to crash through lines of heavy infantry. It should be noted that not all Scythians fought on horseback. Some components of their armies were probably footmen, but the lion's share were certainly saddled up. Throughout much of the first millennium BC, the Scythians and their sister tribes would fight with, conquer, or otherwise influence mind-bogglingly vast territory, and enter the historical records of a diverse array of ancient cultures. The first wave of campaigns undertaken by Scythians proper began in the early 7th century BC, when they burst onto the scene and engaged in a century's worth of warfare upon the civilizations of the Caucasus and the Middle East. First, they devastated the ancient kingdoms of Urartu and Assyria. Following up on this momentum, King Mage pushed further south, launching an expedition into Egypt. Cowed by the massive horde at his doorstep, Pharaoh Psamtik I bequeathed the Scythian king with lavish gifts in order to spare his kingdom. In 612 BC, the Scythians allied with their Iranian cousins, the Medes, sacking and destroying the Assyrian capital Nineveh, toppling the Assyrian Empire in the process. This alliance soon fell apart upon their victory, with the Medes turning on the Scythians, forcing them back into their Pontic homeland. Thus began a centuries-long rivalry between the nomadic Iranians and their sedentary Iranian relatives, a trend that would continue when the Persian Achaemenid Empire was founded in 550 BC. Known best for their immortal struggle with the Greek city-states, this quintessential Persian Empire had a complex relationship with the nomads to their north. Many Scythians served as mercenaries and vassals to the Persians, but many more refused to submit their quota of earth and water to the King of Kings, defying the empire's attempts to subjugate them. Perhaps the greatest of Achaemenid kings, Cyrus the Great, conquered the wealthy Lydians, the mighty Medians, and ancient Babylonians. But when he turned his ambitions northwards, he would finally meet his match. In a campaign into what is now southern Kazakhstan in 530 BC, Cyrus came to blows with the culturally Scythian Massagetae tribe, led by a firebrand warrior queen, Tomyris. Tomyris was able to defeat Cyrus in a clash that Herodotus called the fiercest battle fought between non-Greeks ever seen. There the Persian king was slain, and his head claimed by the victorious queen. Cyrus's successor, Darius I, would once again try to subjugate the Horselords in 513 BC, this time focusing on the tribes north of the Black Sea. According to Herodotus' account of this campaign, the Scythians did what they did best, refusing to engage in pitched battles, while using their light cavalry to constantly harass the cumbersome Persian force, drawing them deep into Scythian territory, all the while burning pastures, smashing wells, and raiding Persian supply wagons. Eventually, Darius was forced to retreat. At the end of this campaign, the Scythians had lost a good chunk of their best pasture land to their scorched earth policy. Nevertheless, the nomads retained their independence, and in the decades that followed, they would slowly recover. As one might have guessed from Herodotus' constant appearance in this video, the Scythians have an extensive history with the ancient Greeks, with the two worlds mainly intersecting along the northern coast of the Black Sea. The Greeks had colonies in this region since the 7th century BC, but it was in the 4th century Bosporan kingdom that Greeks and Scythians truly began to live in harmony with one another, thriving as partners in the local fish, grain and slave trades. It was here that a unique style of Greco-Scythian art developed, with Greek artisans crafting ornate gold pieces for Scythian customers, featuring both the old Scythian animal style and Greek humanistic forms as well. This Hellenic influence on Scythian material culture would extend throughout the Ponto-Caspian Steppe, affecting not only Scythian art, but their arms and armour too. That is not to say that the Scythians always maintained peaceful relations with the Greeks. On the contrary, some of their most devastating wars were fought against the Hellenic world. In the latter half of the 3rd century BC, a man known to the Greeks as Attila had become among the most powerful of Scythian kings, ruling a vast confederation of tribes between the Danube and the Don rivers. In 339 BC, he turned his territorial ambitions southwards past the Thracians and into Macedon. The kingdom was still a generation away from the reign of Alexander, but the Great One's father, Philip II, was a military genius in his own right and more than a match for the Scythians. That same year, Scythian cavalry came head-to-head with the Macedonian phalanx on the plains of modern-day Dobruja. King Philip won a decisive victory. King Attila was killed in battle and his army was scattered, his tribal confederation shattering into pieces upon his death. This greatly weakened the power of the Scythians in the Pontic steppe. On that note, let us turn away from the west and take a look at the Scythian influence in the east. Like the western tribes, the Scythians on the Asian end of the Altai Mountains were composed of many diverse tribes, but collectively are referred to as the Saka. Records of their existence are found as far east as the annals of Han Dynasty China. According to the Chinese, the Sakas originally lived between the fertile Ili and Chu river valleys, between present-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, but in the early 2nd century BC, they fell victim to a classic phenomenon known as the nomadic migration domino effect. The Xiongnu, predecessors of the Huns, pushed the nomadic Yuezhi people out of their homeland in modern-day Gansu, China. As a result, the Yuezhi were forced on a mass exodus westward, making war on the Sakas and pushing them out of their homeland. Thus, the Sakas in turn were forced to find themselves a new home. To that end, they saddled up and thundered into the fertile hills of Bactria. At the time, this land was the furthest eastern edge of the Hellenic world, a rich urban empire ruled by the Greek descendants of Alexander's army. By 132 BC, the Sakas had subjugated the Eastern Hellenes and become the masters of the region. The Sakas did not stop in Bactria, but rode further south through the Hindu Kush and past the ancient Indus River. Indeed, for a time, a branch of the Scythians established domination over much of northwestern India, deposing the Indo-Greek kings who had ruled before. The Scythian presence in India would endure, in some form or another, for over 4 centuries. Following in the footsteps of the Indo-Greeks, the Indo-Scythians quickly adopted Buddhism as their faith, slowly abandoning their nomadic steppe roots to assimilate into the culture of their sedentary Indian subjects. Another place the Saka Scythians had a presence was in the desert kingdoms of Khotan and Shule in the Tarim basin. It's not entirely clear how the Saka arrived here, but it was probably via their kingdoms in India. It's equally unclear whether the peoples of Khotan and Shule were predominantly ethnic Scythians. However, the common languages of these kingdoms were Eastern Iranian dialects closely related to the Scythian tongue, which suggests that descendants of the steppe nomads were the dominant population in the region. Whatever the case, these kingdoms were heavily Indianized and Buddhist. The arid desert offered little in the way of grazing land, so nomadic pastoralism was not an option. Instead, the population flourished in dense cities built upon oases and rivers. It was a far cry from the grassy plains and rugged nomadic lifestyle in which Scythian culture was born, but it could be argued that some form of Scythian culture, albeit hybridized and evolved, survived in this region. The most notable legacy of these oasis states is their interaction with the Middle Kingdom. As China's Han dynasty expanded westwards under the reign of Emperor Han Wudi, they came into contact with the cities of the Tarim basin. At various points throughout the 2nd centuries BC to AD, the Indo-Scythians of the Tarim basin were tribute-paying vassals of Imperial China, who used the region as a buffer zone to prevent being flanked by their greatest enemy, the nomadic Xiongnu. Eventually, like with all peoples and cultures, the Scythian world transitioned from its golden age into its twilight years. Over the centuries, different people groups would come and replace them in different chunks of their traditional heartland. In the early centuries AD, the Scythians proper were largely subjugated by their Iranian cousin tribes, the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians continued the legacy of Iranian nomadic pastoralism in the region for a time, before being subsumed by the same wave of Gothic and Hunnic invasions that would eventually take down the Western Roman Empire. The Slavic expansions between the 5th and 10th centuries AD ended the Scythio-Sarmatian presence on the Pontic steppe for good, and before long, the Iranian nomads had assimilated into the medieval forebears of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. In India, the Scythians eventually lost their territories to other power players in the region, like the Sassanids, Indo-Parthians, and Guptas. Whatever cultural presence they had in the region was eventually absorbed into the Indian mainstream. Meanwhile, the Scythians of the Tarim basin and most of Central Asia were largely displaced and assimilated by a wave of early Turkic migration from the 6th century AD onwards, a legacy we still see today as the majority of modern Central Asia is Turkic-speaking. The Scythian world was largely gone by the early Middle Ages, but the Scythian people were not wiped out entirely. The medieval Alans, who established a powerful kingdom in the Caucasus between the 9th and 13th centuries AD, were believed to be the descendants of Queen Tomarus and the Scythian Massagetene tribe. While their kingdom was wiped out by the Mongol invasion in 1239 AD, they remained in the region into the present day in the form of the modern Ossetian people. Today, the Scythians are a faded memory, a footnote in the history books of Greece, Iran, India, and China. Yet, as army after army of horse-riding, bow-shooting nomadic warlords thundered across the Eurasian steppe over the centuries, whether they acknowledged it or not, they were building upon the legacy of the Scythians, the first and original Horselords of the ancient world. Our series on ancient civilizations will continue, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description, to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.